Tonight, you could get a tiny cut, wash it, put on a bandage, and forget about it. Your biggest worry might be a scar. But imagine getting that same cut 20,000 years ago. No antibiotics, no emergency room, no surgeon waiting nearby. Just you, the wound, and whatever your group knew about keeping someone alive. Because back then, the cut itself wasn't always the biggest danger. What came after it could be far worse. And here's the part that's easy to get wrong. Ancient humans weren't simply surviving because they were tougher than us. They had something else working in their favor. Something that had nothing to do with modern medicine. So how did our ancestors survive in a world where an injury we barely notice today could sometimes become deadly? The first thing to understand is that a cut wasn't automatically a death sentence. Most injuries didn't need some miraculous treatment. They needed something much simpler, a chance to heal without getting worse. And humans seem to have understood this long before they understood why wounds became dangerous. Archaeological evidence gives us clues. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, researchers found Neanderthal remains with serious injuries that had healed. One individual had survived major trauma to the arm and lived long enough for the bone to repair itself. That doesn't prove Neanderthals had hospitals, surgeons, or modern medicine. But it does tell us something important. When someone was badly injured, they could survive long enough to heal. And that raises a bigger question. Who was taking care of them while they recovered? Because if you couldn't walk, hunt, or protect yourself, surviving wasn't just about what your body could do. It depended on what the people around you were willing to do. And that changes the story completely. But there was still a problem their care couldn't always solve. A wound could look small on the outside, while something far more dangerous was happening underneath. Infection. You could clean a wound and protect it, but sometimes that wasn't enough, because the real danger wasn't always visible. A cut could look small on the surface, while an infection was quietly spreading underneath. Today, you know what to do almost automatically. Wash the wound. Keep it clean. Cover it. Watch for signs that something is wrong. But imagine trying to make those decisions without knowing bacteria existed. You couldn't see them. You couldn't look at a wound and know exactly what was happening inside. You could only watch the person. Maybe the wound started getting more painful instead of less. The skin became red and swollen. They developed a fever. They grew weaker. And suddenly, the tiny cut from a few days earlier wasn't a tiny cut anymore. It had become a threat to the entire body. And this is where ancient humans had one advantage that didn't require a microscope. They could remember patterns. If one kind of wound repeatedly became worse after being left dirty, people learned to be more careful. If a particular plant, substance, or treatment seemed to help, they could remember that too. They didn't understand bacteria. They didn't need to. They could learn from what happened. And archaeological evidence suggests that some ancient humans were using plants and other natural materials in ways that may have had medicinal effects. At Shanidar Cave, researchers found evidence associated with plant use, including pollen and plant remains. Some interpretations have suggested medicinal use, although the exact purpose remains uncertain. So we shouldn't imagine Neanderthals carrying around a prehistoric medical textbook. They didn't have one. What they had was something much older. Trial and error. Someone tried something. It seemed to help. The knowledge was remembered. And if it worked again, it could be passed on. But here's the dangerous part. Sometimes they got it right. And sometimes they didn't. Because without modern medicine, there was no reliable way to tell which wounds would heal, and which ones were about to become deadly. Imagine living in a small human group thousands of years ago. You don't have a doctor to tell you what to do. You don't have a medical book. You don't even know what bacteria are. But someone in your group gets injured. You watch what happens. Maybe a wound is left dirty, and days later the person becomes sick. Another wound is cleaned and protected, and the person recovers. You don't know why the difference exists, but you notice it, and that observation can become a lesson. The next time someone is injured, the group may do things differently. Maybe they clean the wound. Maybe they cover it. Maybe they use something they've seen help before. If it seems to work repeatedly, that knowledge becomes worth remembering. And when the next generation grows up, they inherit more than genes. They inherit experience. That's one of the overlooked advantages our ancestors had. They didn't need to understand the chemistry behind a treatment to learn that it sometimes worked. They could test ideas against reality. Some would fail. Some would help. And the useful ones could survive in memory and tradition. That doesn't mean ancient humans had a reliable medical system. They didn't. Their knowledge was incomplete, inconsistent, and sometimes dangerous. But it was still knowledge. And over thousands of generations, small observations could accumulate into something surprisingly powerful. Because survival wasn't only about having a strong body. It was also about remembering what kept people alive. But what happened when observation and basic care weren't enough? What happened when someone suffered an injury so serious that they could barely function? That's where the evidence becomes even more remarkable. Some injuries couldn't be solved with a clean wound and a little rest. A broken bone could leave you unable to walk. A serious injury could make hunting impossible. And if you couldn't hunt, escape danger, or protect yourself, the problem wasn't just the injury, it was survival. Yet archaeologists have found something remarkable in ancient human remains: healed injuries. Bones can preserve evidence of what happened long after a person is gone. When a bone breaks and the person survives, the body begins repairing it. New bone forms around the break. The pieces gradually stabilize, and if that bone eventually healed, archaeologists can sometimes see the evidence thousands of years later. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, several Neanderthal individuals show signs of serious injuries that had healed. That means these weren't people who died immediately after being injured. They survived long enough for their bodies to repair themselves. And think about what that required. If you broke your arm today, you could get an X-ray. A doctor could check the damage. You might get a cast, surgery, pain medication, physical therapy, and weeks of follow-up care. Now take all of that away. No ambulance, no X-ray, no orthopedic surgeon, no modern pain medication, just an injured human being living in a small group. And somehow, some of them recovered. But there was an even more extreme problem. What happens when the damage is so severe that the body can't simply heal around it? Archaeologists have found evidence that prehistoric humans sometimes performed surgery. One remarkable example comes from Neolithic France, where researchers found a skeleton showing that part of the lower leg had been deliberately amputated. The most extraordinary detail wasn't the amputation itself. The bone had healed. That means the person survived the procedure and lived afterward. Just stop and think about that. Someone had to remove the damaged limb. Someone had to keep the person alive afterward. Someone had to provide food and water while they recovered. And someone had to protect them from the dangers of everyday life. There was no hospital waiting at the end of it. No antibiotics. No sterile operating room. No modern anesthesia. Yet that person survived. And suddenly, the question changes. It's no longer just, how did ancient humans treat injuries? It's, how did an injured person survive at all? The answer may have less to do with prehistoric medicine, and much more to do with the people standing around them. The answer may be simpler than medicine. They had other people. If you couldn't walk, someone could bring you food. If you couldn't hunt, someone else could hunt. If you couldn't defend yourself, someone could stay close and protect you. And if you were too weak to care for yourself, someone had to care for you. That changes the meaning of survival. Because an injured human didn't always have to survive alone. Imagine breaking your leg thousands of years ago. You can't follow the group. You can't hunt. You can't run from danger. You can't simply decide to push through it. Your survival now depends on something outside your injured body. Someone has to notice that you're missing. Someone has to stay behind. Someone has to bring food. Someone has to help you move. And someone has to believe that keeping you alive is worth the effort. That's a very different picture of prehistoric life. The strongest person wasn't necessarily the one who survived. Sometimes survival belonged to the person who had people willing to help them. And this may explain something archaeologists keep finding in ancient human remains. People who survived serious injuries. A healed bone isn't just evidence that a body could repair itself. It can also be evidence that someone survived long enough to let that healing happen. Because bones don't carry food. Bones don't provide shelter. Bones don't protect an injured person from predators. People do. And that's the deeper story hidden inside those ancient skeletons. Human survival wasn't only a biological process. It was a social process. We evolved not just to survive as individuals, but to survive as groups. A person who couldn't hunt could still contribute later. A person who was injured could recover. A child could grow up because adults protected them. And an older member of the group could survive long enough to pass knowledge to the next generation. Care wasn't just kindness. In a world without hospitals, it could be a survival strategy. And once you look at human history that way, some of the most important survival tools stop looking like weapons. They start looking like each other. But injuries weren't the only moments when human lives hung by a thread. There was another danger that followed humanity for thousands of generations. One where experience, cooperation, and care mattered just as much. Childbirth. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous moments in an ancient woman's life. Today, when a pregnancy becomes dangerous, modern medicine can intervene. Trained staff can monitor the mother. Doctors can perform surgery. Blood transfusions, antibiotics, and emergency care can turn situations that were once deadly into survivable ones. For most of human history, none of that existed. And yet, generation after generation, women gave birth. That doesn't mean childbirth was safe. It wasn't. A complication could become an emergency with no modern way to stop it. But again, women weren't necessarily facing that danger alone. Other women could help. Someone who had witnessed dozens of births could recognize familiar stages of labor. She could know when something looked unusual. She could help the mother change position, provide comfort, and pass on practical knowledge learned from previous generations. They didn't have modern obstetrics, but they had something that came first: experience. And the same principle appeared when people became sick. Imagine someone in your group develops a fever. You don't have a thermometer. You don't know whether it's a virus, bacteria, or something else. You can't call a doctor, but you can watch. Is the person getting weaker? Are they drinking? Can they stand? Are they getting better or worse? Someone brings water. Someone keeps them warm. Someone stays nearby. Maybe the group knows a plant or treatment that has helped before. None of this guarantees survival. But that's the point. Ancient survival wasn't about having the perfect treatment. It was about making enough good decisions before it was too late. And sometimes the body itself helped. Pain is one example. Pain is an alarm. It tells you something is wrong and can force you to stop using an injured part before you damage it further. Today, we can reduce that alarm with powerful painkillers. Our ancestors often couldn't. So a painful injury could force someone to stop hunting, stay close to camp, and depend on others while the body recovered. That dependence might sound like weakness, but in a cooperative group, it could become a survival advantage. The injured person rested. Someone else brought food. Someone protected them. And the body got time to heal. So when we ask how ancient humans survived without modern medicine, the answer keeps coming back to the same place. They didn't always survive because their bodies were stronger. They survived because their bodies could heal. Their minds could learn. And other humans could help when those things weren't enough. But there's a problem with looking at ancient survivors this way. We tend to forget about everyone who didn't survive. And that changes the entire story. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Ancient humans weren't simply tougher than you. They didn't have some superhuman immune system that made infections harmless. They still got sick. They still broke bones. They still suffered during childbirth. And they still died from injuries that modern medicine can often treat. So if they weren't invincible, why did humans survive at all? Part of the answer is biology. Over thousands of generations, natural selection favored traits that helped people survive long enough to reproduce. But that doesn't mean every ancient human was a biological superhero. Survival depended on circumstances too. A person with a serious injury might have survived because the wound stayed relatively clean. They might have had enough food. They might have been surrounded by people willing to care for them. They might have recovered because their body was able to fight off the infection. And sometimes, they might simply have been lucky. There's another reason ancient humans can look almost superhuman to us. We mostly see the survivors. Imagine two people with similar injuries. One recovers. The other dies from an infection. Thousands of years later, archaeologists might find evidence of the first person's healed bone. But the second person's story may leave almost no obvious trace. So when we discover a skeleton with a healed injury, we're seeing evidence of someone who made it through. We're not seeing all the people who didn't. That's survivorship bias, and it changes how we should interpret ancient medicine. The fact that some people survived serious injuries doesn't mean those injuries were usually survivable. It means that survival was possible, sometimes because of care, sometimes because of accumulated knowledge, sometimes because the person's body was resilient, and sometimes because circumstances happened to go their way. This is why ancient humans shouldn't be romanticized as naturally tougher than modern people. They weren't living in a world without danger. They were living in a world where danger was everywhere, and the margin for error was much smaller. A wound could heal, or it could kill you. A broken bone could mend, or it could leave you permanently disabled. A mother could survive childbirth, or she could die from a complication no one knew how to stop. Ancient healing wasn't secretly as powerful as modern medicine. Some treatments probably helped. Some may have done nothing, and some may even have made things worse. They had no reliable way to identify bacteria, viruses, internal bleeding, or many other hidden threats. So when we say our ancestors survived without modern medicine, we shouldn't imagine that they had a better medical system. They had a different one. It was built from observation, experience, cooperation, practical techniques, natural materials, and sometimes pure luck. And even with all of that, the odds could still be brutal. Which raises one final question. If ancient humans weren't simply tougher, what did all of this survival eventually become? So what changed? If our ancestors already knew how to observe wounds, care for the sick, and protect the injured, how did we get from that to modern medicine? The answer wasn't that humans suddenly became smarter, and it wasn't that survival began with the invention of antibiotics. Something much older was already happening. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans watched. They remembered. They experimented. They cared for the injured, and they passed useful knowledge to the next generation. Every generation inherited what the previous one had learned, then added something of its own. Slowly, scattered observations became shared knowledge. Shared knowledge became organized knowledge. Organized knowledge could be tested, and tested knowledge became science. Science gave us things our ancestors could never have imagined. We learned what bacteria were. We learned how infections spread. We learned how the immune system works. We developed anesthesia. We developed surgery. We developed antibiotics. We learned how to replace blood. We learned how to see inside the body. And suddenly, problems that once depended on observation, experience, and luck could be treated with precision. Think about what that means. Your ancestors saw a wound getting worse and had to guess what might help. You can walk into a clinic and have that wound examined. They watched fever and weakness without knowing the cause. We can identify pathogens and test treatments. They depended on someone in their group knowing what to do. We can call on an entire system of doctors, nurses, laboratories, surgeons, and medicines. The difference is enormous, but the underlying behavior is surprisingly familiar. We still observe. We still remember. We still experiment. We still care for the injured. The technology changed. The survival instinct didn't. That's the bigger story. Modern medicine didn't replace the ancient human ability to survive. It amplified it. A bandage is an ancient idea made more effective. Surgery is an ancient impulse transformed by anatomy, anesthesia, sterilization, and technology. Caring for the sick is ancient. Modern medicine simply gave that care an extraordinary amount of knowledge and precision. And that means the hospital you're standing in today isn't completely separate from the world our ancestors lived in. It's the latest chapter of the same story. A story that began with a human being looking at another injured human and asking a very simple question: what can I do to help? And maybe that's the part we forget when we think about modern medicine. We see the hospital, the surgeon, the antibiotics, the machines, the technology. But underneath all of it is something much older. A human being seeing another human being in pain and refusing to simply walk away. That instinct existed long before hospitals, long before antibiotics, long before anyone knew what bacteria were. It was there when someone stayed beside an injured hunter, when someone brought food to a person who couldn't walk, when an experienced woman helped another through childbirth, when someone remembered which treatment seemed to help last time. Those actions didn't always save lives. Sometimes they failed. Sometimes people died from injuries that would be routine to treat today, but enough people survived. They learned. They remembered. They passed that knowledge forward. And eventually, those small acts of survival became something extraordinary. Modern medicine. So the next time you clean a cut, take medicine, or walk into a hospital, remember what you're really looking at, not the replacement of ancient survival. It's amplification. The technology is new. The instinct isn't. Your body carries the legacy of countless generations who faced injuries, infections, hunger, childbirth, and danger without hospitals, antibiotics, or modern surgery. They weren't invincible. They weren't superhuman. They didn't always know what they were doing. They simply kept learning, kept caring, kept adapting, and somehow, they kept the story going. You're here because they did. And if you want to keep exploring the strange survival abilities hidden in the human story, stay with us. Because the more we understand where we came from, the stranger our existence becomes.